Hello. So we are at our last session of Rainbow's End by Werner Vinge. It's only taken me 2 months, so I don't know. I haven't done this before, but I guess it's not too bad. We actually made it all the way through. Like I said, the middle part was um, a little dry, but I think it was informative. I hope it was informative. So just as a recap of our last section, I was just looking back over what happened last week. And essentially, it was sort of the crescendo of the engagement in the lab. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm actually going to, if you hold with me, retweet my that I'm going live because there's not a lot of people here. And I'm just going to, I don't think, just going to give people a heads up in case more people want to join in. Okay, thanks for your patience. Okay, so the last session, it was sort of the crescendo of what was happening in the biolabs in underneath San Diego. And the grandfather, Robert Gu, they were essentially like the launch pad with the mice was getting ready to go. And Miri's dad, who was in charge, he sent a bomb and it blew it all up. But Miri and her grandfather were down in the labs. And so it was like this molten lava that was melting everything and moving forward. And so at the very last thing, I think this cabinet full of mice fell on Robert Gu and he couldn't get out from under. And then Miri wouldn't leave him. And then eventually she just lay down, but this lava was all coming up to the cabinet. And so the lava was coming in and he somehow held out his arm to keep the lava from going. And he was trying to communicate, and actually he ended up communicating with the Indian guy whose plot this all was, but he couldn't do anything. And so then the next scene was that they were sort of under house arrest, the grandfather and Miri in sort of under, deep state intelligence, and they'd been fixed up mostly, but I guess Robert Gu's arm had melted off in the lava. And Miri's mother, Alice, who had been the cybersecurity expert, she was still caught up in this sort of mental trauma that was brought about by sort of having her mind hacked during all of the events. So there was that. And then the last chapter that I read was sort of the culmination of the high school parent night performance that Robert Gu was working with Juan Orozco, and their project that they presented was sort of in the stadium full of all these parents watching. And it was like a musical performance that was brought together with hundreds of student musical performers. And so those are sort of the last three chapters. And then, so tonight it's about 50 pages. We'll see. Let's see, Freedom on a Very Long Leash. That was already, we did that one. So this starts with chapter 34, which is called The British Museum and the British Library. So I guess we're still at the parent event in the stadium. The kids rushed off the bleachers, only slightly impeded by the fact that Chumblick and company could review the evening and determine just who had been unacceptably bumptious. Juan and Robert were slower, hanging with the other demo students and exchanging congratulations. Grades for the demos wouldn't be available for another 20 hours or so. They would have plenty of time to agonize over their failings. Nevertheless, Louise Chumblick looked quite cheerful, giving each student her congratulations and deflecting all manner of questions about whether this or that deficit should truly be of any grand significance. Still no sign of Miri or Bob. Robert's attention was filled with the kids and Chumblick and Juan Orozco, this last person alternating between hysterical relief and the conviction of failure. So it was without forewarning that Robert found himself face to face, almost nose to nose, with Winston Blount. Behind the former dean, Tommy Parker was standing hand in hand with Zhu Zhang, and now that was surely the strangest pairing to come out of this adventure. The little guy was grinning ear to ear. He flashed a thumbs up at Robert. But for the moment, Blount had all his attention. Robert had seen little of Tommy and Winnie since that night at UCSD. They and Carlos had spent several days at Crick's clinic. As far as Robert could tell, certain deals had been made, much as in his own case, and now they were loose. The official story was just what Bob had said. The cabal activity had been a protest that got out of hand, but they had never intended to damage laboratory equipment, and they were all terribly sorry for that. The unofficial tales of heroic sacrifice helped explain why the university and the biolab seemed happy not to pursue the matter. If the elder cabal kept its collective mouth shut, there would be no consequences. Just now, there was an odd smile even on Winnie's face, and he turned to Juan and reached out to shake Robert's hand. Even though I've dropped out of Fairmont, I still have family here. Doris Schley is my great grandniece. Oh, she did well, Winston. Thank you, thank you. And you? Winnie hesitated. In years past, praise for Robert Goo came from all quarters, and it had often been used as a club to beat down Winston Blount. You wrote something wonderful there, Robert. Those lyrics. I would never have imagined such a thing writing on Beethoven and in English and Spanish. It was art. He shrugged, as if waiting for a sarcastic put down. It wasn't my work, Winston. And maybe this is a put down, but I don't mean it that way. Juan here did the lyrics. We collaborated all through the semester, but on this, I let him go. I just critiqued the final effort. And honestly, and this Chumley character in The Death of Lies, honestly, Juan is responsible. Oh. Well, Winnie rocked back and then really seemed to notice Juan. He reached over to shake the boy's hand. It was beautiful, son. And sideways, still incredulous glance at Robert. Do you know, Robert, in its way, that was as good as what you did in the old days. Robert thought a second, listening to Juan's lyrics with his imagination, the way he used to listen to his own poetry. No, I was better than that. Much better. But not better like being in a different world. If the old Robert could have seen the lyrics, well, the old Robert couldn't abide second raters. And given half an excuse, he would have made sure that Juan's art died a borning. You're right. Juan made a beautiful thing. He hesitated. I don't know what. I mean, the years have done, Winston. Juan looked back and forth between them, and there was the beginning of shining pride on his face, though he seemed to guess that there were words unspoken going between Winnie and Robert. Winnie nodded. Yes, lots of things have changed. The crowd was diminishing, but that just meant that some of the kids thought that they could run around even faster. They were getting jostled by the flow of bodies and even louder and shouting and laughter. So if you didn't do the lyrics, what was your contribution, Robert? Aha. I did the time lag synchronization as much as it could be done. Really? Winston was trying to be polite, but even his own choir experience, he didn't seem especially impressed. Well, it had been a bit ragged. Zhu to Lena, for God's sake, say something to him. Lena. Lena to Zhu, buzz off, you. Zhu to Lena, then I will speak for you. After a few pleasantries, Winnie took off in the direction of the Schley family and Tommy and Zhu Zhang in tow, but Robert noticed a line of golden text drifting out behind Zhang. Zhu to Robert, that was great, Robert. Juan was oblivious of Zhang's silent message. Dean Blount didn't understand your part in our project, did he? No, but he liked what he did understand, and it doesn't matter. You and I both did better than we thought we would. Yes, we really did. And Juan led him back along the bleachers. Even if Bob and Mary weren't here, Juan's own parents were. Greetings and congratulations all around, though the Orozcos still didn't know what to make of Robert Goo. A clot of family and friends remained on the soccer field for some time. More than anything else, the parents seemed faintly surprised by their children. They loved the little klutzes, but they thought they knew their limits, and somehow Chumlig had transformed them. Not into supermen, but into clever creatures who could do things the parents themselves had never mastered. It was time for pride and a little uneasiness. Mary was still out of sight. Poor Juan, and I hope Alice got home okay. One-armed, he wasn't quite good enough to check that in mid-flight. Robert pressed into the densest part of the crowd, the folks swirling close around Louise Chumlig. She looked happy and tired, and mostly she denied responsibility. I just showed my students how to use what they have and what the world has. He reached across and managed to catch her hand. Thanks. Chumlig looked up at him, a crooked smile on her face. She held onto his hand for a moment. You, my very strangest child. You were almost the reverse of the problem I had with the others. How's that? Well, for everyone else, I had to make them reach out to learn what they were. But you, well, first you had to give up what you had been. Her smile was fleetingly sad. Be sorry for what you have lost, Robert, but be happy with what you are. For everyone's sake, I had to make, all along she knew. But someone else had her attention, and she was gaily assuring them and all the rest that the school year would be even more exciting than what had gone before. Robert left Juan and the others when speculation turned to what the regular demos would be like. The kids didn't want to believe that they could be outdone, not after tonight. Robert spotted two familiar figures on his walk back to the traffic circle. I thought you were with Winston, he said. We were, said Tommy, but we came back. We wanted to congratulate you on your music sync gimmick. Zhu Zhang nodded in agreement. Of the two, only she was wearing. A congrats logo floated out from her. Poor Tommy was still lugging around his laptop, though whatever remained inside surely belonged to the secret police. Thanks. I'm proud of it. But emphasize the word gimmick. No one really needs to sync manual music across thousands of miles of cheap net. And basically, I just took advantage of routing predictabilities plus knowledge of the music being played. Plus some timing analysis of the individual performers, right? Right? Said Tommy. Well, yeah. Plus some counter jitter you inserted, said Zhu. Robert hesitated. It was fun. Tommy laughed. You should go. You should do some ego surfing. Your hack was noticed. Back when I was young, you could have got the patent off of it. And nowadays, Zhu patted Tommy's shoulder. Nowadays, it would be worth a decent grade in a high school class. You and I, we have things to learn, Thomas. Tommy made a grumbling noise. She means I should be learning to wear. He glanced at the young-looking woman. I never dreamed that X Zhang would end up saving my life. But of course she did it by getting us all arrested. Lena to Zhu. Parker is afraid to try new things, even when he brags about the future. Closed message. They walked in silence for a few steps. There were more golden words from Zhang. She was getting better at silent messaging. Zhu to Robert. Sigh. Tommy is old and all the medicine hasn't helped him that much, and he is afraid to try new things. Robert stifled a startled glance at the woman. But when had the geek become a parlor shrink? But she could be right about Tommy. Tommy was surely oblivious of all the sming, but a familiar crafty grin was spreading across his face. What? Robert finally said. I'm just thinking. Our UCSD op was the biggest and most dangerous I've ever been a part of, and we got used. Yeah. But it was a lot like these modern whatsits, these affiliances. We contributed, and in one way, we got what we were aiming for. Robert thought of the stranger's promises. How is that? Well, we nailed the Huertas librarium project. Yeah, but the library books were all consumed. Tommy shrugged. I kind of like the library militant vision. The point is, we terminally embarrassed Huertas. And that's a triumph? Well, they were walking along the traffic circle now, followed by a hopeful automobile. Yep, you can't stop progress, but we stopped Huertas long enough for the other events to come to our rescue. He glanced at Robert. You haven't heard? You wear all that fancy equipment and you can't keep up with the news? Tommy didn't wait for a reply. You see, Huertas was in such an awful rush for a reason. It turns out the Chinese were chewing up the British Museum for the library faster than we ever guessed. And the Chinese have years of experience in non-destructive digitization, and they're positively gentle compared to Huertas' shredder operation. They made the San Diego effort look foolish, and they even got haptic data off non-book exhibits. There's clear sky between them and everyone else, including that he can't claim any sort of priority, and it was long enough so that the Chinese were able to frost the cake. Tommy reached into his jacket and pulled out a 3-inch square piece of plastic. Here, a present for you that cost me all of $19.99. Robert held up the dark plastic. It looked a lot like the diskettes he used on his old PC at the turn of the century. He pointed a query at it. Labels floated in the air. Data card, 128 PB capacity, 97% in use. There was more, but Robert just looked back at Tommy. Do people still use removables like these? Just paranoid proprietary and old farts like me. It's a nuisance to carry around, but I have a reader right here in my laptop. Of course, the data is all online, along with a lot of cross analysis that the Chinese will be charging you extra for. But even if you don't have a card reader, I thought you'd be interested in holding this in your own hot little hands. Ah, Robert peeked at the top directory. It was like standing on a very, very high mountaintop. So this is the British Museum and Library as digitized and databased by the Chinese Informagical Coalition. The haptics and artifact data are IORES, low res to make it all fit onto one data card. But the library section is 20 times as big as what Max Huerta sucked out of UCSD, leaving aside things that never got into the library. That is essentially the record of humanity up through 2000, the whole pre-modern world. Robert hefted the plastic card. Well, it doesn't seem like very much. Tommy laughed. Well, it's not. Well, Robert started to hand it back, but Tommy waved him off. Like I said, it's a present. Put it on the wall where you can remind yourself that it's all we ever were. But if you really want to see it, just look at the net. The Chinese have it pretty well meshed, and all of their special servers are really clever. Tommy stepped back and motioned to the car that was trailing them. The rear door opened, and he waved Zoo in ahead of him. For a weird instant, Tommy looked like an old rake with some sweet young thing, just another image from the past that had nothing to do with the truth. So, Huertas is out of the shredding business, and the Chinese promise their follow-ups will be even gentler than what they did to the British Library. Imagine soft, pinky robot hands patiently picking over all the libraries and museums of the world. They'll be cross-checking, scanning for annotations, giving the whole new generation of academic types like Zulfi Sharif something to hang their degrees on. He waved at Robert. Hi-ho! It was almost midnight when Zhu Zhang got back to the Rainbow's End. Lena was still up. She was in the kitchen fixing some kind of snack. Lena's osteoporosis forced her to lean so far forward that her face was just inches off the table. It looked strange, but the wheelchair in the kitchen's design gave her plenty of freedom to maneuver. Zhu eased into the room, feeling entirely embarrassed. Sorry for cutting you out, Lena. The other twisted around to give her a direct look. There was a lopsided grin on her face. Hey, no problem. You young people need your privacy. She waved for Zhu to sit down and have something to eat. Yes, well, Tommy isn't really so young, and she felt a blush coming on. I don't mean physically. He wants to keep up with progress, but he just can't cope with everything that means. Lena shrugged. Tommy's mind is better than some, and she grabbed a sandwich off her plate and gave it a munch. Do you think he'll ever get his edge back? Could be. Science marches on, and even if it doesn't help in Parker's case, we can give him pushes in the right direction. A big part of his problem is that life was too easy for him when he was young, and he's too ornery to try anything that's really hard for him. She jabbed a hand in Zhu's direction. Eat up. Zhu nodded and reached for a sandwich. They had been over this before. In fact, it had been such discussions that had made all the difference for a certain Dr. Zhu Zhang. But maybe she had more on the ball than Tommy. Her chief problem in the near future might be in avoiding government job offers. Zhu bit into the sandwich, peanut butter and jelly, but not bad, really. Have you had a chance to do your thing with the various people we saw today? Play shrink, you mean? Yeah, I've reviewed your epiphany log. I posted some anonymous consults. The advice we gave Carlos Rivera was fine. He's got an ongoing problem, but, that's life. And as for Juan, we've done our best there, at least for the moment. Zhu smiled around a mouthful of peanut butter and jelly. It had taken her some time to realize what a genius Lena was. After all, psychiatry was such a soft specialty. Lena said little Miri loved to view her grandmother as some kind of female wizard. She claimed to know that even though the girl never announced the fact. Now Zhu had realized Lena was everything Miri imagined, at least metaphorically. I'll never understand other people, but with Lena seeing out of my eyes and chatting in my ear, I am learning. There are still mysteries. I don't understand why your granddaughter is pushing Juan away. Sure, kids don't remember what really happened in Pilcher Hall, but we know they were coming to be friends. And if we could only get Miri's logs that the government was still withholding. Lena didn't answer directly. Alice is home from the hospital. Yes, I caught that fact from you. No details. There won't be any details. Alice was sick and now she's better. And in fact, I've known for a long time that Alice plays dice with her own soul. She nearly lost it this time, and somehow that's related to my ex husband's grand screw up at UCSD. I think Alice will recover, and that should help Juan with Miri. Lena sat back in the chair, or rather, she let the chair tilt up into a different position. On her own, Lena couldn't really straighten up. We've talked about this before. Miri can be stubborn to the point of being an asshole. She inherited that trait from the SOB, skipping a generation over Bob. And now that stubbornness has latched onto some deep down guilt. Subconsciously, Miri feels that she and Juan messed up and did this terrible thing to Alice. Well, that doesn't really sound like science, Lena. I'm sparing you the technicalities. Zhu nodded. You get results. There are people at Fairmont High who think I'm some sort of human relations genius. Me. Lena reached her hand a few inches across the table as far as her twisted bones could go. Zhu took her hand gently in her own. We've made a good team, you and I. Haven't we? Said Lena. Yes. It wasn't just Lena's way with people. It wasn't just saving Tommy and his friends. There had been those dark days at the beginning of her time at Fairmont when she was sure she could never come back. And Lena wasn't so happy-go-lucky either. And together they had climbed into the daylight. Zhu looked at the little old lady who was 10 years younger than herself. Together, Lena and I have become something rather remarkable. Apart? Lena, do you think I'll ever be as good at seeing into people the way you did? Lena shrugged and gave a little smile. Oh, I don't know. Zhu cocked her head, remembering little incidents here and there across the last few months. Lena Gu almost never lied outright. She seemed to realize what that would do to her credibility, but Lena could deceive, even in the face of a direct question. Do you know, Lena, when you say, oh, I don't know, and shrug, that means you're thinking not in a million years? Lena's eyes widened. She gave Zhu's hand a squeeze. Well, there you go. Maybe in this case, it won't take a million years. Good, because I want to tell you, Lena, I don't think Robert is the SOB you remember. I think he's really changed. Lena's hand slipped away from hers. I take it back. In your case, a million years may not be enough. Zhu reached out, but Lena's hand was back in her lap. Never mind. There were things that had to be said. Robert was brutal in the beginning, but look how he has helped Juan. I have a theory. She flicked the nature citation across the table at Lena. This wasn't really her own theory. Robert has had the equivalent of a major trauma, the sort of thing that rebuilds a person's worldview. You read too much crap science, Zhu. Leave it to us professionals. It's not as if he's been all unwound. He has his memories, but physically he's just a young man. He has a second chance to get things right. Can't you see that, Lena? Lena flinched at the words and then hunched forward even more. She was silent for a very long moment, staring down at her twisted body, her head swaying in a gentle negation. And finally, she cranked her gaze up to Zhu's. Something that might have been a tear glistened in her eye. You have a lot to learn, my girl. And with that, Lena backed away from the table, her chair making an agile rise and turn. Afraid I'm done for the evening, and she rolled off toward her bedroom. Zhu took care of the dishes. Usually Lena insisted on doing the kitchen work. That's something I can still do with my own hands, she often said. Not tonight. As if I were just a little more clever about people, thought Zhu. I might know why. Chapter 35, The Missing Apostrophe. Zulkifar Sharif was no longer in the graduate program at Oregon State. Robert encountered a very old-fashioned error message. No longer a registered student, no longer at OSU. Even Sharif's enum was a stub labeled vacated. That was a little scary. Robert hunted around. Worldwide, there were about 1,000 matches for Z Sharif. None of the accessible ones were a good match. The rest were people trying with various degrees of competence to keep their privacy. But the Zulfi Sharif whom Robert sought was still a techno bumpkin. After an hour or two, Robert had tracked him down at the University of Kolkata. Sharif was very subdued. Professor Blandings dismissed me. From the OSU graduate program? In my time, we professors were not so powerful. While Professor Blandings had help from your authorities, I spent several weeks trying to explain myself to some very insistent US government agents. They couldn't believe that I was an innocent who had been succeeded in being multiply hijacked. Huh. Robert looked away from Zulfi Sharif. At the city all around them, the day looked hot and muggy. Just beyond their small table, crowds swirled, young people laughing and smiling. The skyline had its share of tall and ivory towers. It was the Kolkata of modern Indian vision. And for a moment, he was tempted to open a second naysayer channel and try to figure out what was real and what was hype. No, concentrate on figuring out what part of Zulfi Sharif is real and what part is hype. I suppose the best evidence the cops think you're innocent is that they let you return to India. Indeed, though sometimes I wonder if I'm not a fish on a very long line. He gave a wan smile. I really did want to do my thesis about you, Professor Gu. In the beginning, it was an academic desperation, and you were the trophy I could sell to Annie Blandings. But the more we talked, the more I. How much was you, Sharif? How many? I wonder that too. I mean, there were at least two besides myself. It was most frustrating experience, sir, especially at the beginning. I would be in the middle of speaking with you, going through the questions that I knew would impress Professor Blandings, and then whack, I was a mere bystander. So you could still hear, and see? Yes, often that was so. And so often I think the others were using me to generate some questions for inspiration and then warping them to their own purposes. And in the end, and my confessing this to your police was a great mistake, in the end, I came to treasure those bizarre interventions. My dear hijackers were asking questions I would never have conceived. So I hung around throughout your library on conspiracy. And in the end, looked and in the end, I looked the perfect foreign provocateur. And if you hadn't been there in the night of the riot, my Mary would have died. What did you see, Zulfi? What? Well, I had been the most thoroughly looked at. Sorry. What? Well, I had been the most thoroughly locked out that evening. The other players on my persona had agendas that did not include any discussions of literature, but I kept trying to get through, and the police claimed I never would have succeeded without terrorist assistance. In any case, for a few seconds, I could see you lying on the floor, and you asked for my help, and the lava was creeping up against your arm. In truth, I couldn't see any more than that. Robert remembered the conversation. It was one of the sharpest fragments in the jumble. The two of them, 8,000 miles apart, sat in silence for a few moments. And then Sharif cocked his head quizzically. And now I am well quit of my perilous library research. And yet I cannot resist asking, you are at the beginning of your new life, Professor. Can we expect something new under the sun? For the first time in human history, a new secret of the ages? Ah, you're right. There is room for something more, but you know, some secrets are beyond the expression of those who experience them. Not beyond you, sir. Robert found himself smiling back. Sharif deserved truth. I could write something, but it would not be poetry. I got a new life, but the Alzheimer's cure, it destroyed my talent. Oh no, I had heard of Alzheimer's failures, but I honestly never suspected you. Thinking there might be another canto of The Secrets was about the only good thing I still hope to come out of this adventure. I'm so sorry. Don't be too sorry. I wasn't a very nice person. Sharif looked down and then back at Robert. I had heard. I mean, in the days I couldn't get through to you, I interviewed your former colleagues at Stanford, even Winston Blount when he wasn't making conspiracies. But it doesn't matter, sir. I eventually realized that you had lost your sadistic edge. Then surely you would have guessed the rest. Do you think so? Do you think your talent and your malevolence were a package deal? Sharif leaned forward and engaged in a way that Robert had not seen since their interviews of the weeks before. I doubt it, but researching the issue would be intriguing, and for that matter, I have long wondered and been too timid to ask. What really changed in you? Were you a decent fellow from the time of your dementia cure? Or was the change as in Dickens, A Christmas Carol, with new experience making you kindlier? He rocked back. I could make such a splendid thesis out of this? His eyes swept back to Robert, questioning. No way. Yes. It's such a great opportunity that I almost forgot my resolutions. And the first of those resolutions is no more activities that get me mixed up with security authorities. He looked up as if unseen watchers. Do you hear that? I am clean in body and soul, and even in my fresh fried clothes. And then addressing Robert once more, in fact, I have a new academic major. Oh, yes, it will take several semesters of prerequisite fulfillment, but that will be worth it. You see, the University of Kolkata is starting a new department with a new faculty, real go getters. We have a long way to go considering the competition from the universities in Mumbai, but the people here have funding and they're willing to take on fresh faces such as myself. He grinned in enthusiasm at Robert's puzzled look. It's our new Institute of Bollywood Studies, a combination of cinema and literature, and I will be studying the influence of 20th century literature on the latest Indian arts. I regret our lost opportunities, Professor Gu, and I'm so happy to be in a major that will keep me out of further trouble with the authorities. Robert was actually busy between semesters. He contrived sync. His contrived sync hack had raised him to the lowest level of guruhood. He'd been noticed by a small company called Comms RS, and in a way, it was a traditional firm. It was old, 5 years old, and it had 3 full-time employees, so it wasn't as nimble as some operations, but it had managed several innovations in concurrent communication. Comms RS had paid Robert to consult for a period of 3 weeks, and though it was clear that the consult was mainly an opportunity for Comms RS to decide if Robert Gu had any future, Robert jumped at the chance. For the first time since he had lost his marbles, he was creating something that others valued. Otherwise, things were not going entirely smoothly. Juan Orozco was gone. His parents had taken him on a vacation to Puebla, where they were visiting his mother's grandfather. Juan still showed up occasionally, but Mary was not talking to him. I'm trying not to care, Robert. Maybe if I stop bothering her, Mary will let me start over. And nevertheless, Robert had the feeling the boy might have been camped out on their front steps if his parents hadn't dragged him away. I'll talk to her, Juan, I promise. Juan had looked at him doubtfully, but don't make her think I put you up to it. I won't. I'll choose the time carefully. Robert had decades of experience in choosing the right time to strike, and this would have been easy. Mary had wangled an incomplete grade on her demo project, and this means that when she finally did perform at the end of the next semester, she would have even higher standards to meet. For now, she was a busybody around the house, mainly taking care of her mother. Alice Gu was a ghost of her former self. The steel of the last 15 weeks of their acquaintance had been torn out of her. The results were charming. More evenings than not, Alice and Mary were down in the kitchen, attempting to make hard work out of modern cookery. His daughter-in-law was distant, but her smile wasn't the meaningless reflex it had often seemed before. And then Bob was out of town again, and Mary seemed to be busier than ever. Every day she had some news for him about her searches on burns and limb rehabilitation. Real soon now, he should use that as an excuse to set her straight about Juan and about himself. Maybe tonight was the right night. Bob was still out of town, and Alice had retired to the ground floor den shortly after dinner. None of Mary's board games tonight. They were fun, one of the nicer things about life since that terrible night at UCSD. But tonight, Robert had finally seen his way through some of the Comms RS problems. Working on them, he lost track of time, and when he came up for air, he had some results, maybe things worth showing his employers. What a good night. Downstairs, a door slammed. His eyes were still on his work, but he heard Mary come pounding up the stairs. She raced down the hallway and into her bedroom. A few minutes later, she came out, and there was a knock on his bedroom door. Hi, Robert. Can I show you some things I discovered today? Sure. She bounced into the room and grabbed a chair. I found 3 more projects that could help with your arm. In fact, the medical condition of Robert Gu's left arm was best characterized by its absence. It was completely burned off at the lower forearm, and then there were 2 places near the shoulder where all that was left was a strip of flesh. His prosthesis was more like an old-style plaster cast. But interestingly, the medics had passed on the opportunity to whack the thing off and fit him with some modern miracle. Reed Weber, the physician's assistant, had resurfaced now that the MDs needed someone to front for them and explained the situation, though perhaps not quite the way the doctors would like. You are a victim of the new field of prospective medicine, Robert. You see, we have prosthetics with 5-finger motor control and with almost the durability of a natural arm, but they're a little heavy, and the sensor system is nowhere near the real thing. On the other hand, there are clear trends in nerve and bone regeneration tech, and even though no one knows quite how it will happen or if it will happen, the odds are that in 18 months, they'll be able to grow out from what you have now, an effective natural arm. and the MDs are afraid that debreeding what's left of your arm for a prosthesis might make the latter solution much more expensive. So for a while, you're stuck with a solution that wouldn't have impressed your grandfather. And Robert had nodded and not complained, because every day, with the dead weight on his shoulder, it was a small penance, a reminder of how close foolishness had come to destroying lives. Mary was oblivious of all of that. In fact, she dismissed prospective medicine as stupidity. Mary believed in making her own medical solutions. So there were these three teams. Robert, one of them had grown a complete monkey's paw, another into a whole limb prosthesis, but it was lightweight, and the third was some improvements in neurocoding. I bet your Comms R Us friends would put you up as a fast-track guinea pig. What do you think? Robert touched the plastic shell that held the remains of his arm. I think we're involving a deal involving a monkey paw is too risky for me. No, no, no. You wouldn't have a monkey paw. The monkey paw was just, and then she hit a Googling look. Robert, I'm not talking to you about some old story. I'm trying to help you. I'm trying more than ever. I owe you. Yeah, tonight was definitely the night to set her straight. You don't owe me. Hey, I can't remember it, but Bob told me what he saw. You put your arm in the way of the molten rock. You held it there. Her face twisted with imagined pain. You saved me, Robert. I saved you, kiddo. Yeah, but I created the problem. I played ball with something evil or something very strange. You were desperate. I knew that. I just didn't know how deep things would get. So we both made a mess. It really was the time to get down on his knees and beg forgiveness. But first, let her know why this was beyond forgiveness. The words were hard to say. Mary, you made a mess trying to fight things, but I was the guy who was set up your mother for what practically killed her. There, it was said. Mary was sat very still, and after a moment, her gaze fell. She said softly, I know. And now they were both very still. Bob told you? No, Alice did. She looked up and she told me they still can't figure out how you could have brought her down. What you did could have brought her down. It's okay, Robert. And then abruptly she was crying, and Robert did get on his knees, and his granddaughter threw her arms around his neck, and she was in full bawl now, her body shaking, and she pounded his back with her fists. I'm so sorry, Mary. And Mary's wail got even louder, but she stopped beating on him, and after half a minute her weeping trailed into choking sobs and then silence, but she held on to him, and her words were halting and muffled. I just found out that Alice is back in training. Oh, she's not even recovered. And Mary was sobbing again. But what does your father say? Bob is out of touch tonight. Out of touch in this day and age? Mary pushed him back, and she started to wipe her face on her sleeve and then grabbed from the box of tissues he set beside her. Really out of touch, like tactical blackout. Don't you follow the news, Robert? Read between the lines. Bob is off somewhere making places and things glow in the dark. She wiped energetically at her face, and her voice returned to something like its usual tone. Okay, maybe not literally. Bob talks that way when he has to do things he doesn't want to do. But I watch the rumor mills, and I watch Bob and Alice, and between the three, I'm a pretty good guesser. Sometimes Bob is out of touch, and I read about something wonderful or something terrible happening in another country. Sometimes Alice goes into training, and I know that somebody needs help, or else very bad things may happen. And right now, Bob is away and Alice is back in training. And so she hid her hands behind her hands for a moment and then resumed wiping her face. My guess is that the top rumors are right. Something awful is happening at Library Riot, worse than a Gen takeover, and now all of the superpowers are running scared. They think someone has figured out how to crack their security. Alice almost admitted that tonight. That was her excuse. Robert sat down again, but on the edge of the chair. His great confession had vanished into the abyss. You should talk to Bob when he gets back. Well, I will, and he'll argue with her, and you've heard that yourself, but in the end, he can't help her. This time, maybe he can go over her head or get the doctors to back him up. Mary hesitated and seemed to relax a fraction. Yes, this time is different. I'm glad we can talk, Robert. Anytime, kiddo. But then she was quiet, and finally Robert said, Are you conspiring or just Googling? Mary shook her head. Neither. I'm trying to call someone, but they're not answering. Ah. You know, Mary, Juan is in Puebla visiting his great grandfather, and he may not be wearing all the time. Juan? I wouldn't call him. He's not very bright. And when the crunch came in Pilchner Hall, he was useless. You can't know that. I know I was down in the tunnel by myself. Mary, I talked to Juan almost every day since I started at Fairmont, and he wouldn't let you down. Think back to the times you do remember. You two must have conspired a lot to keep track of me. I'll bet he played fair. I bet he could be your good friend, another person you could talk to. And for once, Mary's chin came down. You know, I can't talk to him about those things. I couldn't talk to you except you already know. Well, that's true. There are things you can't tell him, but I think he deserves better from you. Mary's eyes flicked up to meet his, but she didn't speak. Remember how I told you? Remember, you remind me of your great Aunt Kara? And Mary nodded. You were happy to learn that, but I think you know how I treated Kara. You were, it was like that Ezra Pound incident over and over again for years, and I never had a chance to make up for that. And she died when she was not much older than Alice is now. Tears were back in Mary's eyes, but she held back the tissues tight on her lap. I went through my whole life like that, Mary. I married a wonderful lady who loved me very much, and Lena put up with more than I ever dumped on Kara, and for years longer. And even after I drove her away, you know how she helped me at Rainbow's End, and now she is dead too. And Robert looked down, and for a moment, all he could think of was lost opportunities. Where was I? Oh, so you think I owe Juan? Dumping on him isn't the same in the same league as my screw ups, but you still have a chance to set things right. He looked at Mary. Her shoulders were hunched. She was shredding the tissues she held in her hands. Just think about it, okay, Mary? I didn't mean to get carried away. And finally she spoke. Have you ever broken a solemn promise, Robert? Where did she get that from? But before he could get his mouth in gear, Mary continued, Well, I just did. And with that, she grabbed the box of tissues and ran from the room. Mary! But by the time he got into the hall, Mary had disappeared into her room. Robert had dithered for a moment, and he could go down and pound on her door, or maybe he should message her. He stepped back into his room, and he turned and saw the golden light on the table right behind where Mary had been sitting. It was a Noom, granting some sort of limited message capability, but he already had that and more for Mary. He opened the golden Enum and looked inside. This one was for Lena Llewellyn-Gu. Robert sat beside the Enum for almost half an hour. He studied it. He studied the documentation. It was exactly what he thought. Lena lives. There was no physical address, but he could write her a simple message. It took him only 2 hours to do so, less than 200 words, and they were the most important words that Robert Gu had ever written. Robert couldn't sleep that night. Morning came, then afternoon, and there was no reply. So this is the epilogue. 6 weeks passed. Robert was watching the news more now. He had learned that the world can bite you. He and Mary compared notes on what they saw. The raids at the edge of the world were allegedly over. Rumors held that little had been discovered. Rumors and some real news spoke of scandals in the EU, Indian and Japanese intelligence services. All the great powers remained very nervous about insert your favorite crazy-ass theory here. On the home front, Bob was back. Robert and Mary took that to mean that some disaster theories were much less likely. Others remained scarily visible. Indeed, Bob blew his stack when he learned about Alice. Things got very tense around the house, and both Robert and Mary sensed heartbreaking battles hiding behind the looks and silences. Mary had years of putting together the clues. Her best guess was that Bob had appealed to the doctors, that he had complained far up the chain of command, and none of it mattered. Alice remained in training. Somewhere in all of this, Juan returned from Puebla. Mary didn't have much to say about him, but they were talking. The boy was smiling more. From Lena, there was silence. She lived. His messages didn't bounce, and her Enum remained accessible. It was like talking to an infinite void. And Robert did keep talking, a message every day, and wondering what more he should do. Zhu Zhang had left Rainbow's End. Lena asked me to leave, Zhu told him. Maybe I pushed her too hard. But I knew where she lives now, and I could go there, and I could make her see how much I've changed, and maybe that would just prove that he had changed in all the ways that didn't matter. So Robert didn't drive out to Rainbow's End. He didn't snoop the public cams there, but he continued to write her, and when he was outside, he often imagined that besides the 7 by 24 attention of the security authorities, perhaps there was another watcher who would someday forgive him. Meanwhile, he threw himself into schoolwork. There was so much to learn, and the test of his time was and the rest of his time was spent with Coms R Us, and they liked his work. 2 months after the Great Library riot, Robert returned to UCSD. He had lost track of Winston and Carlos. It was strange when he thought about it. For a few days, the cabal had been such a tight conspiracy, but now they never spoke. The easiest explanation was mutual shame. They had been used, and their various agendas had come close to killing a lot of people. There was truth in all of that, but for Robert, there was another explanation, something weirder and almost unsettling. The cabal was like a childhood clique. The animosities and closeness now vanished as his childlike attention morphed in new directions. Sometimes the desperation of the fall semester seemed almost as remote as his life in the 20th century. There were so many things he wanted to learn and do and be, and they had so little to do with what had previously consumed him. In the end, it was a project with Coms R Us that brought him back to campus. Jitter and latency were bad problems in video protocols, worse in voice, and absolute death for touchy-feely interfaces. Haptic robots were getting better and better, but they were almost useless when run over the net. Now Coms R Us wanted Robert to try his crazy sync schemes on haptics. In the aftermath of the librariome and the riot, the UCSD administration had dumped farther bushel baskets of cash on the library. In some ways, its touchy-feely experience was better than commercial parks like Pyramid Hill. The question was, how could you export that across the net? He had done plenty of reading and studied the design of touchy-feely bots, but until the problem was solved, there would be no substitute for firsthand experience. And so he took a car to UCSD. 2 months. Not really a long time. The server shacks on the north side of Warshawski Hall had merged. There was a soccer field where the software engineering department had been. Robert could see that this wasn't a destruction related to the library riot or the marine landings. It was a normal churn of any modern institution. He took the footpath through the eucalyptus. As always, coming out of the trees gave the naked eye a sudden vision across miles of tableland into the mountains. And there, standing before it all, was the Geisel Library. It was by far the oldest building at UCSD, one of the 20% that had been rebuilt after the Rose Canyon quake. But that damage had been nothing compared with what befell it during the riot, when the cabal's sponsors literally ripped the east side from its foundations. Any other building on campus would have been razed after such trauma, perhaps restored if it was of sufficient historical value, but neither had happened in the case of the Geisel Library. Robert walked around the north side of the library, down past the loading dock. He had seen views of the structure immediately after the riot, the floors sloping and sagging, the ad hoc buttresses that the fire department had added as an internal servos had burned out, the chunks of 20th century concrete that littered the terrace. Those signs of destruction were gone. The overhanging floors were level once more. The university had not undertaken a simple restoration. On the west, it looks almost unchanged, but there was a perceptible distortion above the loading dock, and on the east, there was a graceful twisting of the building's great pillars. And where those pillars had moved, where the library had walked, now the pillars were set, and all the base was grass, smooth concrete. The tiled path that was the snake of knowledge, looking upward, lush ivy followed the curving twist of the concrete. And where the ivy ended, there were lines of colored pebbles set in the pillars, making bands like stress fringes in the illuminated crystal. And then above that was a rectangle of each floor that was slightly turned from the one beneath it. From the building specifications, Robert could see some of the pillars were carbon fibers embedded in lightweight composite, and yet the building was as real and solid as it looked to the naked eye. More than the building on campus, this was real. This building lived. He took the stairs, stopping at each floor to look around. He recognized the Hasek domain. There were still librarians militant here, But I thought their circle got booted out. In other places, there was craziness to be recognized. The Scoochamoody mythos was eclectic nonsense that he had never figured out. How far it fit with the library metaphors was beyond him, but the Scoochies had won the riot at the library. In other places, both belief circles were running in parallel. You could choose which you wanted or neither. Robert concentrated on management and naked eye views. After all, he was here to study the touchy-feely support. There were haptic robots everywhere, not as many as at Pyramid Hill, but the university had crammed almost as much parallel variety into a few floors of a single building. UCSD had spent an enormous amount of money on the gadgets. There were some free-running models, but most were surface-mounted. These were fast. As quick as librarian militant could reach for the vision of a book, a robot would slide into position, altering its surface just where it would meet the reacher's hand. Robert stood for a few moments, watching the action. The naked eye view was like nothing in his experience. When the student, that's what she was without her librarian militant cover, turned the book in her hands, the haptics flipped in coordination, never losing contact or slipping in a way different from the vision it was supporting. And when she set it on a table, the haptics moved instantaneously to another task, this supporting some Scoochie client in even more unintelligible maneuvering. He noticed that the girl was staring at him. Sorry, I haven't seen all this before. Tragic, not? She gave him a wide grin. Yes, tragic. Somewhere in a high protocol layer, all of this involved books and the contents of books. In the physical layer, it was even more fascinating. He wandered along, his mind far away, trying to imagine how the intricate dance of haptics could be replaced on the robots that were at some distance on the network. If both sides had human players, it would be infernally hard, but if it was asymmetric service, maybe. Hey, Professor Gu, look up here. Robert looked in the direction of the voice. The ceiling above him had become transparent, as had the one above that, and his view had tunneled through the 6th floor. Carlos Rivera was looking back down at him, a happy smile on his face. Long time no see, Professor. Come on up, why don't you? Sure. Robert found his way to the stairwell. The stairs were free of haptic diversions, as was the 6th floor. But there were no more books either. Someone had set up the offices. Rivera gave him a tour. He seemed to be just about the only one on the floor. Right now, the team is spread all over. Some of them are working on the new extensions underground. So what's your job now? Still library staff, I assume? Carlos hesitated. Well, I have several titles now. It's a long story. Hey, come into my office. His office was on the southeast corner with windows overlooking the snake path and the esplanades. And in fact, this was just the cabal had its meetings. Carlos waved him to a seat and sat behind a wide desk. Carlos himself was still overweight, still wore the bottle glass spectacles and the old-fashioned t-shirt, but there was a difference. This Carlos seemed relaxed, energetic, happy with what he was doing. I was hoping we could talk, but things have just been so busy since we almost fucked things up beyond all recognition. Yes, I know what you mean. We were very lucky, Carlos. He glanced around the office. Nowadays, rank would be hard to see in visible things, but much of the furniture and plants were really what they seemed. You were going to tell me about your job. Yes, it's a little embarrassing. I'm the new director of library support. That's the title the university recognizes. In some circles, that's not an important title. Downstairs and across the world, you'll find that I'm other things like dangerous knowledge and the greatest lesser Scoochamoot. But those are different belief circles, I thought. Well, you read that in the Scoochies one, right? But not quite. When the dust settled, there was this very bizarre, compromise isn't quite the right word, alliance, or distance merger might be better. He leaned back in his big chair. It's scary how close we came to blowing up this end of San Diego, but we stopped just short, and that crazy riot made more money than the new cinema release. More important, it sucked money and creativity from all over, and the school administration was smart enough to take advantage. He hesitated, a little sadness creeping into his voice. So we failed in everything we told each other we were trying to do. The books are gone, physically gone, but the Geisel Library lives, and these two crazy belief circles are driving its content all over the world. But you've seen that, right? And that's why you came here. Well, I came down to study your haptics, actually, Robert explained in his interest in distanced interactive touch. Hey, that's great. Both groups have been beating on me to extend our reach, but at a higher level. What did you think of what they're doing in the library experience? Well, the librarian militants look the same as before, I guess. It's an amusing interface if you like that sort of thing. The Scoochies, well, I tried to see what they're doing, but it doesn't make sense. It's so scattered, almost as if each individual book is its own consensual reality. Almost. The Scoochies have been eclectic, and now they have Librariome, and now they're building game consensus down to fine-grained topic levels, often down to individual paragraphs. It's much more subtle than the Hasiksath, though the children pick up on it very quickly. Their real power is that Scoochie can blend realities. That's what's happened with them and the Hasekians. The Scoochies come from all over, even from the failed states, and now they're feeding the digitization back outwards. Wherever it fits, the Hasek people are running things. Other places, other visions, but all with access to the entire body of the library. And if you can crack the problems of remote interactive touch, it should make their attraction even greater. Carlos looked around his office, where the cabal had plotted for such very different ends. An awful lot has changed in just 2 months. Well, what do you think really happened that night, Carlos? Was the riot intended to distract from what we four were doing, or was it the other way around? I've thought a lot about it. I think the riot was a diversion, but one that got out of hand and that ended up causing immense, well, what's the opposite of collateral damage? Collateral benefit? Sharif, whoever he was, more often a rabbit to me, was a merry madman. Rabbit. That was what his interrogators had called the mysterious stranger, and it was also what the stranger had called himself at the end. Well, our part of the business was darker. Rabbit manipulated all of us, each of us according to our own weaknesses. Carlos nodded. Yes. Rabbit promised each of us our secret wish and then defaulted after we had committed the necessary treachery. Though, to be honest, Robert was pretty clear the critter was kaput. Maybe things would have been different if it had survived. His burning hope in the stranger's promise had powered Robert's treason, but that was cold ashes now, thank God. Carlos leaned forward. Beyond the bottleneck specks, his eyes looked skeptical. Okay, said Robert, maybe Rabbit didn't promise everyone something. I think the power-assisted scheming was its own reward for Tommy. That's probably so, but the librarian did not look convinced. Look, we'd know if any of the promises came true, right? It would be spectacular. I bet Winston wanted to, well, where is Winnie these days? He was looking up the answer, but Carlos already had it. Dean Blount was hired by the university last month in the Division of Arts and Letters. Robert's gaze skittered across the search result, but as an entry-level administrative assistant. Yes, it's bizarre. The current dean of A&I is Jessica Laskowitz. She's another medical retread. Back in the aughts, she was secretary in the division, and nowadays the career track for admin assistants doesn't have any ceiling. But Winston is starting awfully far down, and the best gossip is that he and Laskowitz never got along. Oh my, well, I guess maybe Winston finally made peace with his dreams. Like me. In any case, maybe the mysterious stranger really was gone, his extravagant promises dead. He looked up at Carlos Rivera and felt the stirring of a vast surprise. Robert had very little of his own people sense nowadays. The obvious had been to beat him over the head with a club. Well, what about you? Well, do you notice anything different about me, Professor? Robert gave him a close look and then glanced again at the real plush office. Carlos had done well for himself, but Robert had never thought that worldly success would be a demand of the stranger. You seem happier and more confident, more articulate. Bingo, you haven't said one word of Mandarin, not a single JITT slip. Carlos's reply was a smile of purest joy. So you've lost the language. No, but I haven't had a seizure in more than 6 weeks, and the JITT doesn't rule me, and now I can enjoy the language. It has been a great help in working with the Chinese informagical people. We'll be merging their capture of the British Library with what came out of Huertas's default. Robert was silent for a long moment. Then he said, your cure, it could be a coincidence. Well, I've wondered. This is a medical breakthrough that came out of the groups in Turkey and Indonesia, and it had nothing to do with the Veterans Administration or institutional research programs. But that's the way most medical breakthroughs happen these days. And I've had no gloating messages from Rabbit. Everything is in the open, even if the news hasn't got much traction. You see, this treatment for JITT syndrome isn't effective for most victims. They've contacted me through the yellow ribbons because I'm smack in the middle of the likeliest genotype. He shrugged. I guess it could be coincidence. Yes, the heavenly minefield. But that is an awfully big coincidence, Rivera continued. I got what I asked for, and just a few weeks after I did my part of the bargain. And some of my scoochy progress has been strange. I've made agreements in weeks that should have taken a year, and someone's helping me along. I think you're wrong about Rabbit. Maybe he's just lying low. Maybe he can't do all the miracles at once. Professor, are you okay? Robert had turned away and pressed his forehead against the cool window glass. I don't need this. I'm happy with the new me. He opened his eyes and looked through the tears, and down below was the familiar footpath, the snake of knowledge wiggling up the hillside toward the library. Perhaps the mysterious stranger really was a god, or had grown to be one, a trickster god. Professor? I'm okay, Carlos, and maybe you're right. They chatted a few minutes more. Robert wasn't quite sure what they said, but he remembered that Carlos seemed a little worried for him, perhaps mistaking Robert's raw confession for some sort of medical emergency. And then he went down the elevator and back onto the sunny plaza, and hovering imminent all around him were the words of art and science that humankind were busy building. What if I can have it all? So that is the end. I will just read, there's one page that says about the author, so I'll include that. About the author, Werner Vinci is a 4-time Hugo Award winner for novels A Deepness in the Sky and A Fire Upon the Deep, and novellas Fast Times at Fairmont High and The Cookie Monster, and a 4-time Nebula Award finalist. He's one of the best-selling authors in the field and has been featured in such diverse venues as Rolling Stone, Wired, The New York Times, Esquire, and NPR's Fresh Air. Highly regarded by scientists, journalists, and business leaders, as well as readers, for his concept of the technological singularity, Vinci has spoken all over the world on scientific subjects. For many years, a mathematician and a computer science professor at San Diego State University, he is now a full-time author. He lives in San Diego, California. And so we come to the end of Rainbow's End after a couple months. And after this, I think I'm going to probably do A Wrinkle in Time, because I think I need something a bit lighter and a little less technical. And I've read it, I feel like I need to read it about once a year. So anyway, thanks for joining in, everyone, and good night. I hope you enjoyed this read aloud.